Good afternoon. Good morning, everyone, wherever you may be dialing in from. My name is Robert Karanja, and I will be presenting the masterclass this afternoon at DFI on the digital backbone, how to architect trust and transactions in a modern African state. So it is at the top of the hour, 2 p.m. East Africa time, 1 p.m. South Africa Standard Time. So we do have an hour for this masterclass, and I'll get started just so that we have enough time to go through what we need to do and what we need to cover. So I'll just move my slides. This is just some general online platform etiquette for this afternoon's slide. The first one being, please mute your microphone to avoid any background noise. And secondly, if you'd like to speak during the presentation, please either use the chat box or the raise hand function when we get to the discussion session of this presentation. And thirdly, just to please note that the session is being recorded. I may not have direct access at all times to the chat box, so I'll ask my colleague Brianna to maybe read some of the questions as and when we get to the discussion point. So let's get started. A bit about myself. My name is Robert Karanja, and I currently run and manage a small consulting outfit in digital public infrastructure, which is essentially an African-led consultancy that's dedicated to supporting governments and institutions on the deployment of scalable, inclusive digital public infrastructure across the continent. I've had an opportunity to work in this space for a number of years. From a philanthropic perspective, from a technical perspective, I've funded several investments across the continent in a number of countries, about 12 countries so far, and work that has impacted at least 100 million plus African citizens, worked with various government partners and institutions, and through that built out a variety of different projects across the continent. Some of my focus areas has included working on digital ID and foundational ID registries. I've also had an opportunity to work on instant and inclusive payment systems. I do currently sit on the board of the Mojaloop Foundation. Mojaloop is an open source IIPS that has gone live in Rwanda, more recently in Liberia, with several other countries, not only in Africa, but across the world, looking at deploying a Mojaloop IIPS. I've also worked in data governance, sovereignty, and privacy frameworks across the continent. I have a keen interest on looking at cross-border digital public infrastructure, and particularly how we can apply cross-border DPI in making the Africa Free Trade Continental Trade Area a reality. And then finally, also looked at and supported e-government platforms across the continent and also citizen service delivery. Yeah, so that's a bit about my background, and I'll now get into the gist of this conversation, providing an overview of what we'll be looking at today. So this is just a high-level bird's eye view of some of the sessions we're going to discuss today. We're going to be looking at what is the core issue that we are looking at when talking about architecting trust in transactions in a modern African state. The core problem being that many of our systems are currently fragmented and siloed, and how do we transition those systems to unified DPI ecosystems? We'll also take a look at what are the three layers of digital public infrastructure as we understand them, and that would include identity, payments, and the data layer as integrated infrastructure. We're also going to look at what is the trust architecture? How do you balance the need for speed to scale with privacy by design? Well, there's a lot of pressure now on many governments to either roll out instant payment systems, fast payment systems, digital ID programs, but how do you balance that need for getting a speed to scale with the privacy by design? I'll then also take a look at some country case studies, countries that are very close to me and I've had an opportunity of working in. And this includes Ethiopia's FIDA digital ID, Ghana's instant payment system, GIPS, and then finally Rwanda's e-citizen platform called Irembo. I'll also review government-to-person payments and financial inclusion. How can DPI be used to not only enable direct citizen transfers, but also build the case for interoperable payment rails? And then cross-border digital public infrastructure and the Africa Free Trade Continental Trade Area. How do we actually actualize the AFCFTA through cross-border digital public infrastructure? What are some of the continental payment rails we need to be looking at? And what does sovereignty in this case, as far as interoperability is concerned, look like? Then we will review as we come to a close the deployment blueprint and pitfalls. We're going to look at what a four-phase roadmap would look like and some of the implementation lessons that we have learned over the years. And after that, we'll then dive into a Q&A session. So in a nutshell, that is what we'll be looking at today. And everybody is very welcome to today's session. And I hope it will be a great masterclass for everyone. So moving on to my next slide. I think this is a slide that I thought about quite a bit in terms of when we talk about digital public infrastructure or governments and states deploying digital public infrastructure. What is the issue and what is the problem that we're trying to resolve? And I think this to me is, I looked at two buckets. The problem on one side that we are currently facing, and then what the DPI blueprint states. So the core problem, I mean, as I see it currently, is that in many governments across the continent, in many line ministries, in many departments, data exists. But this data or databases often exist in silos, so they're not speaking to each other. And for any Kenyans, for example, who are signed into this call, you have a national ID, and then you've got a tax number, which we call a PIN, right? You've then got a passport, which has a different number. And then you may have a national health insurance number, which is completely different. And this data is sitting with different line ministries, different agencies, siloed with little to no communication across those databases. And so that's the issue with the fragmented systems that currently exist. And then, if you contrast this with, say, for example, Ethiopia, which has the FIDA ID. The FIDA ID then becomes the shared and trusted identity layer for not only ministries and departments, but any other agency, including both the public and the private sector, that need to provide services to a citizen, right? So that becomes the single source of truth. And as you'll see when we delve into the Ethiopia case later on, FIDA was built on open source MOSIP, which is an open source ID platform. And Ethiopia has done tremendous things in terms of being able to not only customize it, but make it work for their various use cases. Just going back to fragmentation again, you'll often have duplicate data. It's possible that you may even have ghost beneficiaries. When you're talking about ministries, for example, you may even have ghost beneficiaries in payrolls. It's not uncommon to hear of either ministries or cities in those countries where you have a subnational layer of government. You may have even counties, and where you have these beneficiaries on payroll who are getting paid every month, but these individuals do not actually exist. And so what happens to the payroll budget is just going up and up year in, year out. Social registers may also be duplicated. So if a country needs to send out G2P payments to either the elderly, people who may be disadvantaged, marginalized, you then find that very often one individual may receive even three payments because their data sits in different databases and there is no alignment in terms of who this individual is. And then also the cost of fragmented systems. As a citizen, if you need to go check on your data from the tax office, there is the cost of not only time, but also transport to that office. If you're applying for a passport, there's a cost of time and transport to that particular office. You may need to check some health records, right? And so there's a cost of time and transport to being able to do that. So, you know, ultimately, when transitioning from a fragmented system to an interoperable infrastructure, the fix is a combination of both architectural and not only just technical. So build a shared rails once and for all, and then let every ministry, department, and agency plug into that. And that's really the core problem that digital public infrastructure is looking at resolving from an African context, right? Briefly, I know many on this call will already have this background information in terms of what are the key layers of digital public infrastructure, and I'll just pick on the core ones that we generally tend to discuss. And DPI, of course, has evolved, into so many different use cases, but these are the key primary layers of digital public infrastructure that would be relevant in this context. One is identity, and what identity does, it really creates trust. An ID says that the individual who is standing in front of you is who they say they are. Okay, that's what that ID does. If you look at what Ethiopia is doing with FIDA and Nigeria's NIN, these are foundational registries. So they're not single purpose products, but are actually designed to authenticate any transaction that is taking place in either Ethiopia or in Nigeria. The second layer of digital public infrastructure, which we're all familiar with, is payments or the transaction engine. The Ghana Instant Payment Switch, GIPS, and also M-Pesa or PesaLink in Kenya, which is an ecosystem that links wallets, mobile wallets, banks, and settlement in real time, could then fall into the category of the payments layer of digital public infrastructure. R-Switch in Rwanda, which is Rwanda's switch operator, that integrates both mobile wallets, bank wallets, fintechs, and essentially any wallet that exists in the country to be able to send seamless instant payments, is part of that payments infrastructure. And then finally, the third layer of digital public infrastructure is the governance layer of the data layer. And this is really underpinned by a Data Protection Act. So in Kenya, we have a Data Protection Act that was enacted in 2019. Rwanda also has a privacy regime, and very many other countries across the continent have enacted a privacy regime, essentially a legal layer that is built alongside and not after the technology. So when looking at these three layers of digital public infrastructure, they're really going to add value when they're fully integrated, right? So across the three of them. And then identity becomes the trust anchor, such that if you're just going to roll out an ID without relevant use cases, for example, payments, then that just becomes a card, right? Again, if you have payments without governance, then you create some level of risk. So these three layers deliver value to the citizen when fully integrated. I'll move on to the next slide on, there's a need to want to speed up the adoption of digital public infrastructure in many countries. The issue of being able to balance urgency and trust, or the speed of scale versus privacy by design, is one that many governments are currently facing. Scaling digital systems is a major policy initiative or imperative for many countries. And when I think of an example, I can think of one that's closer to home for me. Several years ago, when I was working in digital ID, Kenya attempted to roll out a digital ID labeled Huduma number. And Huduma number was launched very fast. But that speed to get to scale created issues when we looked at the privacy and the design around it. And the whole rollout of digital ID or Huduma number was halted by the courts because the data protection impact assessment had been skipped. So the speed without the trust architecture has cost us years. And to date, Kenya is still going through that whole process of trying to roll out digital ID. There's a new iteration, which is the Maisha number, and that's a rebuild. And this is being framed around privacy and inclusion, precisely because of the lesson that was picked up from the rollout of Huduma number, right? Again, privacy by design in practice will speak to minimizing biometric exposure and keeping verification local, right? So pull a yes, no check rather than copying the citizen's data to every agency that needs that data. And then consent registries. Citizens should also be able to see who has queried your record and when, and that trust is retained through visibility. Right? So that whole dilemma of balancing the agency and trust is one that many governments are currently dealing with. And I don't know whether there's a perfect solution, but there does need to be some thinking behind the speed to get to scale and the privacy by design, having some sort of right fit in terms of being able to determine what makes the most sense in that particular country's context. So the anchor of trust. When we look at trust, the fact is that foundational identity is the bedrock. Without foundational identity, payments and G2P cannot verify who it is that they're paying, right? The ID, again, says that the person standing in front of you or the person transacting with you is who they say they are. And that's built on trust. And there's some clear examples on the continent. When we discuss Ethiopia and FIDA, FIDA in Ethiopia has essentially been mandated for all banking transactions. So the ID then became a validation layer into the financial system. You cannot transact in the financial system without your FIDA ID. And building FIDA on an open source platform, such as MOSIP, means that the state in Ethiopia owns the code and the data, or has full access to the code and the data. There is no extraterritorial dependence on a vendor who's offshore. And so the state then is able to customize and roll out this idea. And we'll talk about the numbers as we move along, the speed to which Ethiopia has been able to roll out FIDA more effectively than possibly any other ID program that's run on the continent to date, right? So the anchor of trust is important in terms of how do we then architect several sovereign legal identities. At which point do we make the ID the foundational bedrock for any transaction in that country, any process? How do we grow the need and the purpose for standardized open core or open code protocols, right? Rather than dependency on foreign or proprietary systems that will probably mean a much longer journey and more expensive journey for that particular country. So we are currently, it's 22 past the hour. And at this point, I did want to run a quick poll. And my colleague Brianna, who's on the call, will run this poll. And essentially, the question is, does your country have a digital ID system? Does it have an operational foundational digital ID system? And the options are yes, it's fully operational. 2, in development or pilot. 3, planned but not started. And 4, no current plans. And so we'll just leave that poll open for a few minutes as we pick the responses from each of the participants. And then we'll circle back to see what the numbers look like. So please respond to that, and then we'll circle back in a minute or two. Thank you. Okay. I think we've come to the end of the poll. 71% of you have responded to the poll, and the results are up on the screen. So the question again was, does your country currently have an operational foundational digital ID system? 53% of you said yes, and it's fully operational. 23% of you said that the digital ID system is currently in development or pilot stage. 7% of you said that the digital ID system is planned but not yet started. And 16% of you estimate that your countries have no current plans. Excellent. So I think we'll pick up that a bit further when we go into the Q&A session at the end. So I just wanted to move quickly to, these are discussion questions that I'm just putting up on the screen for now. Not that we're having the discussion now, but I'm just putting up on the screen for now. We're going to review these questions at the end of the presentation. I'll try and finish as early as I can so that we can have conversations around this. And Brianna will share them in the chat. So question 1 is the silo problem in your context. So essentially asking all of you to count the number of systems for one particular service in your country, one critical public service. It could be registering a business or getting a passport, for example, and name the real cost. What does that fragmentation cost look like to the citizen, to the government, and to the economy? The silo problem, right? Working in different silos. So that's question 1. Question 2, speed versus trust. Governments are facing a lot of pressure, and they're also putting a lot of pressure on themselves to show DPI results quickly, right? But the trust architecture takes time to get it right. So in your context, what is the greater risk? Moving too fast and eroding citizen trust, or moving too slowly and deepening digital exclusion? And I just want to double tap again to my earlier comment on, Kenya's Huduma number, digital ID, which was rolled out extremely fast and was halted by the courts, versus a slower but trusted rollout. Which risk is greater as far as you see it? That's question 2. Question 3 looks at inclusion, right? And identity as anchor and gateway. So what is the exclusion risk from an African perspective? Digital identity is the anchor of many DPI stacks, but ID systems can also exclude the most vulnerable. I remember a couple of years ago looking at some issues that were coming up in Uganda's enrollment of their digital ID, where many farming communities, especially in remote areas, many farming communities, you had individuals whose fingerprints were not being captured clearly by the enrollment equipment, right, because of the manual work that they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And so it's very easy to then say, okay, fine, we have X% of individuals whose fingerprints we cannot read correctly. We will figure out a solution for them, and you skip them and you move on to the next, right? Because again, there's this urgency to enroll as many people in a time frame, in a particular time frame. You want to avoid, say, for example, the rainy seasons. You want to avoid election season. So you just go out and keep enrolling these individuals. But when you meet individuals who may have challenges in enrollment, like that farming community, then you tend to skip them. So it can also exclude the most vulnerable. And so how do you design a system that is simultaneously secure and universally inclusive from day one? And so we'll review those questions towards the end of this discussion as I move on to the rest of my presentation. As I said, we would look at a case study, and Ethiopia is an extremely exciting case study from an African perspective. I've had the wonderful opportunity of not only getting to know, but also to work closely with our good friends at the National ID Authority and on FIDE ID. And I guess in terms of background to how Ethiopia has built its foundational ID system, Ethiopia has used an open source ID platform known as MOSIP, MOSIP, which is a sovereign vendor neutral choice. So they have access to the full code for MOSIP. The National ID Authority and other relevant government agencies in Ethiopia have gone all out in terms of building the capacity around customizing MOSIP and really building FIDA with MOSIP as the basis to suit the unique needs of Ethiopia. Currently, as we speak, Ethiopia's plan was to enroll somewhere between 90 and 100 million individuals. 3 years ago, so in late 2022, early 2023, Ethiopia had little to no registrations at all or enrollments as they were building out and customizing their system. As we speak, Ethiopia has enrolled at least 45, actually past 45 million individuals. And the plan is to get to 100 million, 90 to 100 million by the time the program gets to maturity. And I guess one of the interesting things about the case study from Ethiopia is the fact that ID has been wired into the very DNA of all the services that are both being provided by the public sector and the private sector in Ethiopia. Just a couple of days ago, the National ID Authority and Safaricom Ethiopia was signing an agreement, to have Safaricom then onboard their customers and enroll their customers, issue SIM cards and other services, including mobile money, using FIDA as the trusted ID. And so FIDA is used in banking transactions, health, integrated into mobile money, access to any government service you can think of. So the key here being that you've got an ID system that is adding value to the citizens on a day-to-day basis because you're building relevant use cases around it. And so it's not just the issue of carrying an ID card. I've just put in a test ID card there as the image, but that ID card actually provides you with access to so many services, both within the public and the private sector. And it's that use case ability that makes it such an attractive choice for everybody. And so it becomes mandated for everyone to have FIDA if you want to transact, right? So I think biggest lesson that I pick from Ethiopia's journey with FIDA has been the fact that an open source foundation has enabled Ethiopia to scale to millions, so 45 million plus as we speak, in under 3 years without a proprietary or vendor lock-in, which is a real issue in many countries. And perhaps I can explain a bit what I mean by a proprietary or vendor lock-in. A proprietary digital ID system is usually provided by a private entity, and there are various systems around the world that have been used in the past. But the challenge with the proprietary systems is that government then becomes, or the citizens then become a user of that service. But for any changes, any customization to be made, any major updates to be made, the country would need to go back to the vendor to request for those changes. And that usually costs money and time. right? So that's the big difference between what FIDA is doing with open source architecture and what a proprietary vendor system would give you. So I'm not saying it's better or worse, but that aspect of speed, control, sovereignty is a trade-off that governments would need to look at. On the transaction layer, I think the key output here is the fact that you do want to have interoperable rails so that any wallet or account, whether it's mobile, bank, fintech, SACCO, depending on the context, can pay any other wallet. As a citizen, one should not care which operator or bank sits on the other side. You'll just send money and it moves. An African exemplar from this perspective would be Ghana's GIPS, the Ghana's instant payment system, which enables mobile money interoperability with all bank accounts or bank wallets and Ghana Pay accounts all through one switch, right? So you can move money from MTN Momo to an ABSA account in Ghana through GIPS, right? And it's seamless, it's fast, and it's instant. If you look at countries such as Kenya, we have very much a mobile-driven economy, so M-Pesa is dominant in many cases. But M-Pesa plus bank interoperability through a switch such as PesaLink is owned by the Bankers Association in Kenya. That drives roughly 90% mobile to bank penetration, right? And the idea being that with when Kenya is able to adopt a national payment switch or nominate a national payment switch, then regardless of which wallet is sending money, the receiving wallet will receive that money instantly. Costs can be determined by the regulator in consultation with the market, but it should be completely agnostic. It doesn't matter whether you're sending from a mobile wallet, a bank wallet, fintech wallet, anyone on the receiving side should be able to receive that money instantly. And so GIPS really stands out there. GIPS in Ghana stands out there as an exemplar, right? Interoperability again speaks to the fact that you don't have a single dominant app, but it turns payments into public infrastructure. So any wallet can send money to any other wallet regardless, right? And that's really what you're looking at with interoperability. So I spoke about Ghana and GIPS. GIPS has unified all telco wallets in Ghana, microfinance and card rails into one interoperable switch. It's really what you would look at as an example of a genuine national payments backbone. Ghana was also able to initiate some policy changes, including repealing a 1% levy in 2025, and interoperable transaction values have jumped sharply as friction fell. The volumes have run into hundreds of millions of transfers monthly, with value in the trillions of cedis by late 2025. So in this case, the transaction or the policy choice of removing a transaction tax, the e-levy that I referred to, can unlock adoption as much as the technology itself. And you can see the numbers and they speak for themselves. Billions of transactions monthly, and trillions in terms of Ghana cedis that are moving across this interoperable switch. And it's agnostic. It doesn't matter where the money is coming from and where the money is going. GIPS enables a seamless transfer in that case. And so Ghana is an exemplar when it comes to a fully interoperable switch on the continent. Right. Again, an interoperable switch can also drive financial inclusion, especially when it comes to government to person or G2P transfers. Linking a foundational ID to a payment switch so that government money lands in the right wallet or in the verified citizen's account, not in an intermediary. During COVID, Togo was able to roll out this program quite quickly using a platform known as Novisi that paid unconditional cash to informal workers during the pandemic. It was fully digital, built in-house in under 2 weeks and reached hundreds of thousands of people with no in-person contact because the verification could be done digitally. And again, the benefits for an interoperable G2P platform such as this is that it eliminates distribution middlemen, and leakage. Every payment can be audited against a legal ID, and disbursement scales instantly during shocks. And these shocks are coming more and more often. It could be a pandemic, a health pandemic, as we saw in COVID-19, droughts, and even floods, right? So G2P only reaches people who can be identified and who hold a wallet. And so then ID becomes the primary inclusion point in running an effective G2P program. Data exchange and sovereignty. So a federated model or federated API would keep data at its origin. And so a civil registry in a particular country, tax, health, registries are then not put into one honeypot, but actually sit in a secure data center at its particular origin. You then layer that with a verified Data Protection Act. And so Kenya's Data Protection Act is a good example of how we've been able to then cover those federated digital registries. And this provides also legal recourse, right? Should data either be leaked or used inappropriately, an appropriate Data Protection Act will then provide legal recourse in how we deal with that issue. Audit trails. Are citizens able to see which agency has queried their data or their record? And countries such as Rwanda and others are moving towards this transparency. And I'll be speaking about Irembo very soon. And then sovereignty. Data localization is a big discussion topic in many governments across the continent. And open source stacks keep public data out of the reach of extraterritorial legal demands. And so sovereignty again is another issue that can be covered around data exchange and sovereignty. So how has Rwanda done this with Irembo? Irembo can best be described as a modern e-citizen platform that provides citizen access. It's a consolidated, fragmented government process into one e-service portal. Hundreds of public services are now being offered on Irembo. This could include birth registration, civil registration, passports, permits from various government institutions. And so what has happened is you've then got millions of citizen accounts and applications that are processed daily and annually with a strong year-on-year growth. It has also built the trust foundation in terms of Rwanda does operate under very strict privacy laws, showing that a single front door plus real governance can build citizen confidence in a platform such as Irembo. And I believe that the consolidation of services in a platform such as Irembo, and not necessarily more apps, is what citizens actually experience as digital government. And I know many countries across the continent have modeled and studied and looked at how Estonia has built out its digital government platform. A few visits to Estonia will indicate, it takes hours perhaps to open a business, hours to register an individual who's just been born digitally. And even when one passes away, the government is able to close out that person's ID within hours. And so Estonia is usually seen as a model of what effective e-government looks like. And Rwanda is very much building a robust platform with Irembo to be able to do that and provide citizen access immediately and fast. What are some of the strategic pitfalls to avoid when building out digital public infrastructure systems across the continent? We've talked about vendor lock-in and vendor and proprietary lock-in quite a bit. Locked source, any updates, any changes, any customization needs to go back to the vendor. Contrast these proprietary systems with open source systems such as Ethiopia's FIDA, and Togo's Togo has also built their digital ID platform on MOSIP. And this then enables the country to have access to the source code and, in a sense, also build up their own data sovereignty. Um, you also want to avoid digital exclusion. And I referred to um, Kenya's iteration of Huduma number and litigation, and the wider risk of biometric-only enrollment shows why analog overrides and inclusive enrollment matter. Worn fingerprints, as in the case of Uganda's ID system with the farming communities, and no connectivity must not mean no identity, right? So how do you overcome exclusion, even in the case where you are trying to transition people from analog systems to digital systems? And then also regulatory harmonization and policies, launching powerful ID and payment networks before empowering an independent data protection authority can often result in a train smash. And so legislation and tech must move hand in hand so that you don't have ID systems or payment systems that are being rolled out that can then be challenged by the lack of appropriate governance. And then framing. I think it's important to realize that there are very many complexities across the continent. Sometimes whether it's access to reliable energy, access um, to connectivity, right? So how do you build and design systems that can be used even in the most remote parts of the continent so that you do not have to be fully available on power on the power grid. You're not depending on 5G systems, for example, to be able to just relay data. Can offline capabilities be built into these digital systems? And that way, you're not excluding people just simply because of where they live or the fact that they do not have access to reliable energy and connectivity. Earlier on, I spoke about the cross-border imperatives and how do we actualize the African Free Trade Continental Area. And I think the AFCFTA is destined to be a huge game changer for the continent. PAPS has been adopted, the Pan-African Payment and Settlement System has been adopted by the AU as AFCFTA's official settlement platform. It roughly now connects 19 countries, I think 150 plus banks and 14 plus payment switches that are settling trade in local currencies and not necessarily in the USD route. There's also been an initiative to build cards or building blocks around cards, a continental cards scheme that's known as the PAPS card and the PAPS African currency. And again, this shows maturity during the course of this year and next year. How do we integrate interoperable sovereign ID so that people can trade across borders? If a trader is seated in Kenya and wants to transact with someone in Uganda, how do you verify the individual who's on the other side of the border? And interoperable sovereign ID is one way of doing this. How do you harmonize verification standards to let and to improve the ability of cross-border traders to prove legal identity at the logistics point or at the borders? And so interoperable sovereign ID becomes a huge signal in terms of building trust even across borders. And then, of course, finally, sovereign DPI must be designed with regional interoperability in mind from the start. And this is really the only way that we can actualize the AFCFTA. I know within the EAC, several countries are already starting to connect their payment switches so that you can have transactions across, I think Rwanda and Tanzania have been the first in getting out of the blocks and being really putting the framework and the infrastructure in place to be able to connect one national switch that's domiciled in Tanzania with a Rwanda national switch and enabling transactions across. And so that becomes a huge imperative if the AFCFTA is going to become a reality. Trade, of course, within African countries has been very low, and we can only grow this if we're able to not only think about cross-border standards and interoperability, but also build the cross-border payment interlinkages across various countries. Finally, I did want to quickly go through what a blueprint for deployment in an African context would look like. And phase one is quite self-explanatory. Legislation. So ensuring the clear statutory rules and fully empowering autonomous data protection agencies to set up the legislative framework. Phase two would look at rolling out foundational ID, digital first registries that utilize open source standards. And MOSIP is just an example, but you could really look at any other open source platform that's out there. Phase three would then be integrating instant switches or instant payment switches, instant and inclusive payment systems that integrate mobile wallets, microfinance, banks via real-time switches. So regardless of where the money is coming from, it can move seamlessly through a national payment switch and is received on the other end, regardless of where it's coming from. And then phase four would be integration of programs such as G2P, government person integration, routing, public cash transfers directly into verified citizen wallets as they were able to do in Togo with Novisi during the COVID pandemic. So I think a lesson out of this blueprint for me, and this is open for discussion, is does the order matter? This order that I've laid out there, does it matter? Can anything within this order be switched around and we still have deployment of digital public infrastructure at scale across the continent? There are countries that would want to lead with technology first and have left legislation for conversations later. Does that change the outcome? And so that's a discussion. I don't have the answer, but maybe something that we can speak about in the Q&A discussion. So I'd said I'd leave a few minutes towards the end of this conversation so that we can have some discussions and also review the questions. But I did want to finish off with this slide that I think trusted African states are built on the back of interoperable digital public infrastructure, not single-purpose software silos. A citizen-first framing is important. Every layer, FIDA has shown us a good blueprint of that. FIDA, GIPS, IREMBO, PAPS succeeds when you reduce the friction for the ordinary citizen. If the friction is high, adoption will be a challenge. And then, I think finally the choice for many African governments is architectural, building shared, sovereign, open rails once and let the ecosystem grow. More recently, I've also been looking at the option of what role does the private sector play in building these shared rails. And private sector has some amazing rails, especially when you're looking at organizations or businesses that are already Pan-African and are working across borders. Can the public benefit from these rails that have been built if private sector is willing to share those at no cost? And then have use cases built on what were previously private and are now public rails and share those out, because this is going to have to be a fine balance between the public and the private sector. And I think part of the reason I'm very excited about working with private sector and private sector champions is the fact that I think the private sector has a lot to contribute, and we can really benefit from not only the experience, but the ability to be able to relate and communicate and onboard millions of customers in a very proactive way. So just again, open for conversation as we move into the Q&A discussion. So thank you very much for listening to me. I think we have 7 or so minutes, and there are probably tons of questions in the chat, which I cannot see. But Brianna, I'll hand over to you to perhaps take us through some of the questions. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Robert, we have quite a few questions today. I'll read some of them for you and then we can dive right in. We have a question from Becky. She's asking if you are using photos for IDs, how do you address religious limitations on this, particularly for women?
Excellent question. Excellent question, Brianna. And I think that's it's a very interesting question in the fact that as much as the ID is supposed to democratize and provide access to citizens, all citizens in a particular country, the request for photos or identity on photos could then be a limiting factor, particularly for religious reasons, right? And so one of the solutions that I've seen, um, and this is just an option that some countries have moved into, is the card does not become, or photo-enabled ID card does not become the primary ID or the source of truth. But if you've biometrically verified ID, then you could actually even generate a QR code that is able to verify that individual because you already hold the biometric records. So the issue of having photo ID then becomes null and void. And cards are expensive. Printing cards is an expensive venture. I think one time we were looking at the numbers in a particular country. I won't name which, but printing a single ID card, which was pin and chip. So remember, it expires like a bank card. I think it was 10 years. Expires just like a bank card would, was in the range of about $10 to $12 per piece, right? So if you're trying to enroll 50 million people, you can do the math just on printing. Yeah. Yeah. So that might be a solution. Yeah. But great question.
Thanks, Robert. We have a question from someone who's not able to attend today, but they really wanted you to have a hear of their question. Habib is asking, are there any examples globally where DPI or similar platforms was built by the private sector rather than government, even at a limited or smaller scale? He says he's been toying with the idea of crowdsourcing information from the public to enable not just payments, but civic activism, movements, crowdfunding, public sentiment analysis, and so forth, and would love to learn from examples globally.
Share so I
Robert,
can
you're
get
still
onto
on
my,
mute.
yeah, sure.
There we
I was
go.
just stopping the share so I could access my button. That's an excellent question. And I think a good starting point perhaps might be doing a review of of the digital public goods registry, right? The DPGA runs a digital public goods registry. And you know, I hinted at the fact that I've started exploring working with the private sector and seeing how the private sector can actually build some of these rails and then give them back, right? Give them back for everyone to use. And I think it presents interesting options because if you look at a bank that is operating across various borders, they are already familiar with onboarding customers in very unique situations in different countries. They've done the KYC and to know that customer very well. So they have millions of verified KYC records. And so they're very well placed to build and give back public rails that can actually enable cross-border transactions very quickly. Unlike trying to build it in one country and then sharing this with a different country that's building on a completely different platform. So the DPGA registry would be a good place to start checking. I was reviewing, I was doing a study on, the digital public goods that have also originated, say, in Africa and are now being used widely across the world. And the one that kept coming up was Ushahidi. And I don't know how many people are familiar with Ushahidi. Ushahidi uh, was widely developed and used during Kenya's election cycle in 2007, 2008. It was then built to be a public good, to be used in reporting incidents around electoral issues, where there was post-election violence in 2007, 2008, and has been used and adopted in various elections globally since, right? So you've now got me thinking perhaps I should start exploring further on areas where the private sector has actually contributed a public good, but we are actively looking at it. And that's a project that we are actively working on in terms of seeing how the private sector that has built excellent rails can then give that back and make it a public good. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. We have another question from Jean. He's coming back to the discussion questions earlier, speed versus trust specifically. Jean asks, in Francophone West Africa, Central Africa, which is the bigger risk for digital identity? Moving too fast or losing citizen trust, or moving too slowly and deepening digital exclusion?
Danae, I'm so tempted to get Jean to get off the mic and perhaps answer that question because he might be better placed to respond to it, or someone else also. There he is. Yes, and actually he's a good friend of mine, so that's why I wanted John to. I figured it was him. So Monsieur Yenga, I'll hand over to you just to give us your experience from Cote d'Ivoire and other West African markets. Thank you. Jean, are you there? Maybe he can't hear us. Yeah, but I'm sure he has the answer to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Jean,
Okay.
you are unmuted, so raise your hand if you want to jump back in. Robert, do you still want to address that question, or do you want to move on to the others?
Let's jump on to another one, and then we'll have John respond to that when he can speak.
Couple of minutes of the
Perfect.
meeting.
We have a question from Faisal. How important is having a robust digital infrastructure to make DPI successful? Many citizens don't have access to connectivity, digital apps, or digital payment rails in many parts of Africa. Are we leading the cart before the horse?
Yeah.
That's a, yeah. That's a great question, and I alluded to it earlier in terms of we've got to build in um, digital public infrastructure that takes into account the lack of appropriate energy in certain parts of the continent, in both remote and urban areas, and also access to connectivity, whether it's internet connectivity, 5G, 4G, 3G. Can we build offline capabilities so that people are not left out just simply because of where they live? And so it's a possibility in many areas. I saw this in Uganda when they were enrolling individuals into their digital ID system in very remote areas. You'd collect the data offline, and then at the end of the day, when the enrollment officers were able to get online, they'll be able to upload the data onto the servers. And so that type of capability then covers the issue of we don't have to wait for power to be there if power may be unreliable or not even available. Or connectivity, right? The data that you're trying to upload you may not have appropriate connectivity to be able to put that into servers. And so they would enroll all these individuals during the day offline. And then at the end of the day or a couple of days later, they would then be able to upload that when connectivity was available. Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. We have a question from Kosi. How much should we pay to join an interoperable platform and share data?
How much should we pay to join?
Yes, yes, that is the question. How much should we pay to join an interoperable platform?
Platform. I think it should be free, right? And if there's a cost to it, it should be next to minimal. Um, because the problem is when you start applying charges to digital public infrastructure. Just before we concluded, towards the end, I was talking about the cost of cards, right? For ID. If you pass a cost of 8, 10, or $12 per card to someone who needs to enroll in digital ID, in many parts of the continent, people will just say it's not worth it. Yeah, it's not worth it. But yes, there's a question also on, who then maintains it and at what cost. And I think if you're looking at transaction costs or charges for services, then they should be as low as possible, but also built on robust systems that do not just break down on a regular basis. Right. But yes, they should be, if you're applying for a passport, of course, there should be a charge for that. You're printing a passport, right? And there's a cost to that. If you're applying for a national health ID card, there's a cost of labor, there's a cost of even printing out that document that needs to happen. So there should be a minimal cost to it, but it should not be an exorbitant cost such that it results in digital exclusion.
Amazing. Robert Coolsey also has a follow-up question. If it is free, then who pays for the maintenance of it?
Which is why I mentioned that for the maintenance, that if there should be a charge for the service that is then pulled into maintaining those systems and keeping at uptime as often as possible. But again, I think governments also don't want to invest in systems that break down often. So there should be some pre-analysis that's being done to ensure that those systems, the uptime is good, and they're not systems that break down on a regular basis. But yes, I fully agree that there should be a cost for the service, but that cost should not be exorbitant.
Thank you, Robert. Jessica asks, I would like to know the opinion of the host of how and if PAPSS advantages could be available to small-scale traders.
Jessica, thank you. PAPS, wow. Then I'm just thinking whether we should perhaps do another masterclass with our friends from both PAPS and AFCFTA so that they can explain those benefits, right? I think there's a lot of advantages that possibly could be discussed, but we probably don't have all the details. But perhaps having onboarded 150 plus banks to enable cross-border transactions, how it works and the architecture, I think, is to be very beneficial for all of us if we were to get some of the PAPS folks and AFCFTA colleagues to come on. So perhaps that's something that we should explore to be able to get the benefits. What does it mean when we have a Pan-African payment and settlement system for even small vendors and individuals across borders? And how does that then actualize the growth or the development of the Africa Free Trade Continental Area? Yeah.
Thank you, Robert. I see Jessica and Rose are very interested in that recommended masterclass. Last question that we have for today is from Thomas. How do we develop digital ID systems that are also secure against digital authoritarianism, state surveillance, and coercion? Cases like Ethiopia are instances where the rapid and mandatory rollout of digital IDs is concerning as it is beneficially or potentially beneficial.
That's a good question. And I talked about right towards the end, I was talking about the blueprint for deployment, what the phases would look like. And in many instances, governments will look at first standing up legislation, right, that sets up what does the code look like and how is data handled, and then also empowering a data protection authority before mass enrollment. Ethiopia has a very good data protection framework in place. And so before even rolling out the ID, My belief is that this would be done while adhering to what the data protection framework in Ethiopia speaks to. And then they've rolled this out on open standards, right? So they've been able to customize it. They've been able to give authority and sovereignty back also to the citizen. When someone is accessing your data, you can give rights to, and actually you're aware of who it is trying to access your data. So there's that communication back and forth between the citizen and the registry. That is a transparent layer, and I think that is important to do. It may not be perfect, but it's definitely an ongoing development that hopefully then empowers the citizen in being able to hold a digital ID that works for them and not against them.
Thank you, Robert. Those are all of the questions that we have today. Attendees, please feel free to send more questions through. We'll definitely be able to answer them offline. So yes, thank you so much. That's all for the questions.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.